The early morning light, filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 50th floor, was a sterile, unforgiving blue. It painted the vast, silent office of Thorn Capital in shades of steel and ice, glinting off the chrome legs of a monolithic desk and the polished surface of a black marble floor. In this cathedral of commerce, Elara Vance was a solitary, silent worshiper, her presence as quiet and unobtrusive as the hum of the central air. She moved with a practiced economy, her hands arranging documents into perfectly aligned stacks, her reflection a fleeting ghost in the glass walls that held the New York skyline captive. The city was a distant, roaring beast, but here the only sound was the soft rustle of paper, a sound that had become the soundtrack to her life, a constant reminder of the world she served but could never truly touch. If you want to discover the one man whose arrival will shatter this fragile peace and force her to confront the very core of her identity, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. Elara Vance was 24, though the weight she carried in the slump of her shoulders belonged to someone much older. A literature graduate with a soul that resonated with the cadence of poetry, she now spoke the language of mergers, acquisitions, and quarterly reports. She was the executive assistant to a man she had yet to meet, a ghost in his machine, hired for her impeccable record and quiet efficiency. Her life was a meticulously organized ledger of duties and obligations, a series of boxes to be ticked off from sunrise to long after sunset. This existence was not a choice but a sentence, a life lived in service of a debt that was not her own, a constant, crushing pressure that had squeezed all the color from her own dreams, leaving only a monochrome reality. The source of this pressure was a quiet, insidious foe, the mountain of medical bills for her younger sister's chronic illness. Each paycheck she earned was not a step toward her own future, but a frantic shoveling of sand against a rising tide of debt that threatened to pull her entire family under. This responsibility had forged her into something she barely recognized, a creature of caution and restraint. While other women her age were exploring the messy, vibrant chaos of love and life, Elara was poring over insurance statements and pharmacy receipts. Her youth was being sacrificed on the altar of familial duty, a slow, quiet burn that left an empty space inside her, a hollow ache that no amount of hard work or stoic resolve could ever seem to fill. It was a silent, private grief for the life she might have had. This life of sacrifice had preserved one part of her, however, keeping it locked away like a precious, fragile heirloom. Elara was a virgin, not out of any strict moral or religious code, but from a combination of profound romanticism and a sheer lack of emotional space. She had never found a man who could see past the quiet, dutiful shell to the dreamer within, and her circumstances had never allowed her the luxury of searching. Her innocence had become the last untouched territory of her soul, a secret garden where the ideals she'd gleaned from her beloved books, of a deep, transformative, soul-shattering connection, could still exist, untainted by the transactional nature of the world she inhabited. It was her final, most fiercely guarded shield against the harshness of a reality that demanded everything from her and offered so little in return. The contrast between her inner world and her daily reality was a constant, dissonant chord. Her fingers, which longed to trace the worn pages of a poetry anthology, instead typed out ruthless corporate strategies. She filed reports detailing hostile takeovers, the cold, predatory language of buyouts, feeling like a foreign dialect on her tongue. Her mind, which naturally drifted to sweeping landscapes and complex human emotions, was forced to focus on stock market fluctuations and profit margins. She performed her duties with flawless precision, a perfect automaton in a tailored but inexpensive suit, but inside, a part of her was slowly suffocating. The sterile, organized space of her cubicle was a reflection of the life she had built, neat, orderly, and completely devoid of the beautiful, unpredictable messiness of genuine living. When she returned to her small, sparse apartment each night, the silence was different from the one in the office. It was not the powerful, expectant silence of money and ambition, but the hollow, echoing silence of loneliness. From her window, the city was a tapestry of a million other lives being lived, a million stories unfolding in the glowing rectangles of distant buildings. She would watch the couples walking hand in hand, hear the faint sounds of laughter from a nearby bar, and feel a profound sense of separation, as if she were watching a film of a life she was not a part of. The emptiness was a physical presence in the room, a cold companion that sat with her as she ate her simple dinner alone, a stark reminder of the passion and connection that existed somewhere out there, just beyond her reach. Some nights, she would stand before the small mirror in her hallway and stare at the reflection of the woman looking back at her. She saw the tired eyes, the disciplined set of her mouth, the quiet resignation in her posture. But beneath it all, a flicker of something else remained, a deep, unvoiced yearning. It was a desire not just for love but for life itself, a craving for an experience so powerful it could crack the carefully constructed facade and force the person underneath to finally emerge. She didn't know what form it would take, but she felt it building like a storm on the horizon. An unconscious touch to her own lips, a deep, shuddering breath was a silent prayer for something or someone to finally break the suffocating stillness of her world. The journey home was a daily descent, a shedding of the sterile, air-conditioned skin of Manhattan for the humid, breathing reality of Queens. The subway car, a rattling metal capsule, carried her away from the towering glass spires of Thorn Capital, plunging her into a subterranean world of flickering lights and the anonymous press of bodies. Each station was a step further from the cold, silent power she served, and closer to the warm, cluttered world she was responsible for. She would watch the faces around her, tired, resilient, etched with the stories of lives lived in the city's margins, and feel a kinship that was both a comfort and a condemnation. They were all bound by the same relentless gravity of necessity, a force that pulled dreams down to the unyielding pavement of rent, bills, and obligations, a world away from the penthouse offices where fortunes were made and lost with the click of a button. Her apartment was on the third floor of a pre-war walk-up, a building that sighed with the weight of its own history. The scent of her neighbors, cooking, garlic, cumin, frying oil, clung to the hallways, a constant reminder of the dense, interwoven lives packed within these brick walls. Inside, her space was meticulously clean, but undeniably worn. The furniture was a collection of inherited pieces and thrift store finds, each item chosen for function over form. It was a home built not on aspirations, but on limitations. From her single window, she saw not a glittering skyline, but a patchwork of other windows, other fire escapes, and the unyielding brick of the building opposite. The space was a perfect metaphor for her life, contained, orderly, with a view that only looked onto more of the same confinement, a quiet, insulated cell where she served out her sentence of duty. The shrill ring of the telephone often shattered the evening's quiet, and Alara knew before answering that it would be her mother. Their conversations followed a familiar, well-worn script. Her mother's voice, perpetually frayed with anxiety, would weave a tapestry of worries: the rising cost of Chloe's medication, a looming utility bill, the noise from the upstairs neighbors. Love was present in these calls, but it was buried under layers of practical concern and unspoken fear. She never asked Alara if she was happy, only if she was managing. Alara's dreams, her feelings, her own life, these were luxuries they could not afford to discuss. She was the solution, the support beam holding up the crumbling structure of their family, and her mother's anxious questions were a constant, gentle hammering, ensuring she never forgot the weight she was meant to carry, a burden that defined her existence. Central to this web of obligation was her younger sister, Chloe. A framed photograph on Alara's nightstand showed a girl with a smile far too bright for her fragile frame, a painful memento of a time before the illness had truly taken hold. Alara's love for her was a fierce, protective fire, the one pure, uncomplicated emotion in her life. But this love was also a chain. Every decision she made, from her choice of career to the clothes she bought, was filtered through the lens of Chloe's needs. The guilt was a constant, low-grade fever in her blood. The feeling that she was never earning enough, working hard enough, sacrificing enough to slay the dragon of her sister's disease. Chloe was both her purpose and her prison, the reason she fought so hard and the reason she could never, ever be free to fight for herself. The physical manifestation of this pressure arrived in thin, white envelopes, a relentless tide of paper that threatened to drown her. Each month, she would spread the medical bills across her small kitchen table, the clinical jargon and staggering numbers a language of despair. She would trace the lines of charges for consultations, procedures, and prescriptions, whose name she could now recite from memory. It was a ritual of quiet desperation. With a sharpened pencil and a worn ledger, she would perform the grim arithmetic of survival, allocating every last cent of her salary. There was no room for error, no space for a small indulgence or a personal desire. Her life was a zero-sum game, where every dollar spent on herself was a dollar stolen from her sister's well-being, a calculus of sacrifice that left her with nothing. This monastic devotion to duty had carved a chasm between Alara and the world of her peers. Invitations from old college friends to go out for drinks or weekend trips were met with polite, vague refusals. "I have to work," she would say, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. The truth was a more complex blend of financial impossibility and emotional disconnect. She could no longer relate to their casual talk of dating, career moves, or travel plans. Their lives seemed to be expanding, full of color and possibility, while hers had contracted to a single, narrow path of responsibility. The growing silence from them was not a judgment, but a natural consequence of her absence. She was fading from their lives, becoming a ghost in her own past, a quiet observer of a world she no longer had the means or the heart to join. Her mother, in her own worried, pragmatic way, saw only one solution to their precarious situation: a strategic marriage. She would speak of sons of neighbors or distant relatives, men described not by their character or their passions, but by their stability. "He has a good job at the post office," she might say. Or, "His family owns a small hardware store." These suggestions were not malicious. They were born of a desperate desire for security. For her mother, love was a secondary concern, a luxury that came after a steady paycheck and a solid pension. To Alara, it felt like another form of transaction, a proposal to trade the last vestiges of her autonomy for a life of quiet, respectable servitude. It was a vision of a future that mirrored her present, just with a different kind of cage, one gilded with the promise of safety but just as confining. In the deepest hours of the night, when the city outside finally softened its roar to a distant hum, Alara would seek refuge in the one place she was truly free. She would pull a worn volume of poetry from its hiding place, the pages soft and yielding beneath her fingertips. The words of poets who had lived and died centuries ago became her confidants, their verses on love, loss, and transcendent beauty, a balm for her starved soul. Here, in the silent communion between her eyes and the ink on the page, she could feel the soaring, untamed emotions that her own life forbade. This small, secret ritual was an act of defiance, a way of keeping a part of herself alive. It was a reminder that another world existed, a world of passion and meaning, even if it was a world she could only visit in stolen moments of solitude. Her virginity had become intrinsically linked to this secret literary world. It was not a religious vow, but a romantic one, the last unwritten page of her own story. In a life where everything, her time, her energy, her future, was already claimed by debt and duty, her body remained her own sovereign territory. The idea of a casual, meaningless encounter felt like a desecration of the one thing of value she still possessed. She held on to her innocence with the same fierce protectiveness she reserved for her books, believing, perhaps naively, that it was meant for a connection as profound and transformative as the poetry she read. It was the ultimate symbol of her hope, a quiet, stubborn belief that a love that was more than a transaction, more than a means to an end, might one day be possible for her. As the night bled into the first gray light of dawn, the cycle would begin anew. She would carefully lay out her uniform for the corporate battlefield: a simple, dark skirt, a pressed white blouse, sensible shoes. It was the armor of invisibility, designed to be efficient, unobtrusive, and utterly forgettable. Standing before the mirror, she would pin her hair back, her movements precise and automatic, constructing the persona of Alara Vance, executive assistant. The reflection that stared back was a stranger, a competent and composed woman whose eyes held none of the longing or the secret passions of the girl who read poetry in the dark. She was ready to return to the 50th floor, to the silent, powerful world of Thorn Capital, unaware that the very foundations of her carefully controlled existence were about to crack. The name Julian Thorn had been a whisper, a myth circulating through the hushed corridors of the 50th floor for the 6 weeks Alara had worked there. He was a ghost in his own empire, a name on letterheads and a disembodied voice on conference calls from Zurich, Tokyo, or some other distant nexus of power. The stories painted him as less of a man and more of a force of nature, a corporate predator who had built his kingdom on the ashes of his rivals, a genius with a heart of Arctic ice. They said he never smiled, that he could dismantle a man's career with a single quiet sentence, and that his personal life was a fortress no one had ever breached. To Ilara, he was an abstraction, the invisible architect of the gilded cage in which she spent her days, a powerful, unknowable entity whose existence barely registered beyond the tasks she performed in his name. His arrival was not announced by fanfare, but by a sudden, palpable change in the atmosphere, like a drop in barometric pressure before a violent storm. A wave of tense silence rolled through the open-plan office. Keyboards fell quiet, and the air itself seemed to grow thin and electric. Then, the summons came via a clipped email from his personal security. "Mr. Thorne's office. Now." Ilara's heart seized, a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She smoothed the front of her simple gray skirt, her hands feeling clumsy and cold. All the abstract legends and whispered warnings suddenly coalesced into a single, terrifying reality. She was about to meet the man who owned not just this building, but a significant portion of her waking life, and she felt as prepared as a field mouse summoned for an audience with a hawk. The walk to his corner office felt like a mile-long journey across a barren landscape. The plush carpet absorbed the sound of her sensible heels, making her advance unnervingly silent. The hallway was lined with imposing, abstract art, slashes of black and crimson on vast canvases that seemed to vibrate with a suppressed violence. The final barrier was a set of monolithic mahogany doors, polished to a mirror shine, reflecting her own pale, anxious face back at her. She raised a trembling hand and knocked, the sound seeming impossibly small in the vast, expectant silence. A deep, resonant voice from within commanded, "Enter." The word was not a request, but a gravitational pull, and with a deep, steadying breath, she pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the sanctum of Julian Thorne, her world tilting on its axis. He was not behind the colossal desk as she had expected. He stood before the panoramic window, his back to her, a tall, severe silhouette against the bleeding afternoon sun. The city sprawled beneath him, a toy set he could rearrange at will. His suit was a shade of charcoal, so dark it was almost black, tailored with a precision that spoke of immense wealth and an obsession with control. He didn't turn or acknowledge her presence for a long, agonizing moment, allowing the silence to stretch and amplify her insignificance. Ilara stood frozen just inside the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, feeling like an intruder in a deity's temple. The room was cold, minimalist, and utterly devoid of personal touches, a space designed not for living but for command. It was the lair of a man who trusted nothing and no one. Finally he turned, and the full force of his presence hit her. Julian Thorne was younger than the legend suggested, perhaps in his mid-30s, but his eyes held a weariness that seemed ancient. They were a startling pale gray, the color of a winter sky, and they assessed her with an unnerving, analytical intensity, as if he were reading the lines of code that comprised her very soul. He was brutally handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features and a mouth that looked as if it had never been taught how to smile. "Miss Vance," he said, and his voice was exactly as she'd imagined, low, smooth, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the sound of polished steel, a voice that gave no quarter and expected none in return. It was the sound of absolute, unshakable authority. Under his penetrating gaze, Ilara felt stripped bare. It was a look that bypassed her carefully constructed professional facade and saw everything beneath. The inexpensive fabric of her blouse, the subtle wear on her shoes, the deep, abiding exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. She felt a hot blush creep up her neck, a humiliating wave of self-consciousness. He saw her poverty, her desperation, her quiet servitude. But then his eyes lingered for a fraction of a second too long, and she saw something else flicker in their depths. Not pity, but a flicker of recognition. It was a strange, unsettling intimacy, as if he saw the dreamer trapped inside the dutiful assistant, a secret she thought was hers alone. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen by a man. And the experience was as terrifying as it was intoxicating. "You have been managing my affairs for 6 weeks," he stated, not as a question but as an accusation. He moved from the window to his desk, his movements fluid and predatory. He didn't sit, but leaned against its edge, crossing his arms and amplifying his dominance of the space. "My previous assistant lasted 3. She was prone to emotional responses." The unspoken warning was clear. She was to be a machine, efficient and unfeeling. He then pushed a thick, leather-bound file across the polished surface toward her. "The preliminary financials for the Sterling acquisition. I need a full summary of all liabilities and potential antitrust conflicts. I want it on my desk by morning." It was an impossible task, a test designed to make her fail, and they both knew it. As she stepped forward to take the file, her fingers brushed against his. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but a jolt of pure electricity shot up her arm, stark and shocking in the cold, sterile room. His skin was cool, but the energy beneath it felt like a coiled spring. His gaze dropped to their hands for a barest instant, and his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. In that brief moment, as the silence hummed between them, Ilara noticed a thin, silvery scar that ran along the back of his hand, disappearing beneath the cuff of his immaculate French shirt. It was a flaw in the perfect, polished armor, a tiny physical testament to some past violence, a glimpse of a history far darker and more complex than the corporate battles he was famous for winning. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his mask of cold indifference snapping perfectly back into place. "That will be all, Miss Vance," he said, his tone clipped and final. He turned away from her, dismissing her as if she had already ceased to exist, his attention returning to the cityscape that was his true domain. Ilara clutched the heavy file to her chest, her heart hammering against it like a trapped bird. She murmured a quiet, "Yes, Mr. Thorne," to his back and retreated from the office, pulling the heavy doors shut behind her. The click of the latch felt like the closing of a cell door, sealing her into a new and far more dangerous reality than the one she had known just moments before. She had survived the encounter, but she felt fundamentally altered by it. Back at the relative safety of her own small desk, the world seemed to have shifted. The familiar hum of the office now felt like a low, menacing growl. The file in her hands felt impossibly heavy, not just with the weight of the work it contained, but with the weight of his touch, his gaze, his presence. She could still feel the phantom sensation of his skin against hers, the chilling intensity in his pale gray eyes. Julian Thorne was no longer a myth. He was a tangible, breathing force of nature, a man of profound contradictions, immense power and a hint of deep, hidden pain. The seed of a dangerous fascination had been planted in the quiet, fallow ground of her soul, a tiny, dark flower beginning to unfurl in a place that had only ever known duty and restraint. The impossible task Julian Thorne had assigned her became the new axis around which Ilara's world spun. The Sterling acquisition file was a dense, cryptic tome, filled with legal jargon and financial figures that blurred into a meaningless dance of numbers before her tired eyes. For 2 days and 2 nights, she lived on black coffee and the nervous energy that thrummed just beneath her skin. The 50th floor, once a silent, impersonal space, now felt charged with his presence even when he wasn't there. His scent, a subtle, clean fragrance of sandalwood and cold ozone, seemed to linger in the air of his office, and she found herself holding her breath each time she had to enter it. The work was grueling, a deliberate test of her limits, but a deeper, more unsettling challenge was taking root in her mind, the memory of his gaze, which had seen more of her than she had ever intended to reveal. The first late nights set a new, dangerous precedent. The rest of the office had long since emptied, leaving only the 2 of them suspended in a glass box 50 stories above the sleeping city. A profound silence settled between them, broken only by the soft click of her keyboard and the rustle of his papers. She worked at a temporary desk in the corner of his vast office, feeling his presence like a physical weight in the room. From the corner of her eye, she would watch him. He worked with a terrifying, single-minded focus, his face illuminated by the cool blue light of his monitor. He was a predator in his natural habitat, and she was a small, quiet creature that had wandered into his hunting ground, trying desperately not to draw his attention while being utterly captivated by his lethal grace. It was close to 2 a.m. when the silence was finally broken. She had been staring at the same paragraph for 10 minutes, her mind foggy with exhaustion, when she felt his eyes on her. She looked up, startled, expecting a sharp reprimand for her lack of progress, but his expression was not one of annoyance. It was one of pure, unadulterated curiosity, a clinical assessment that was somehow more unnerving than anger. "Your analysis of the patent liabilities is insightful," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "You see the vulnerabilities others miss." It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, a cold observation. But it was the first time he had acknowledged her mind, and the validation sent a treacherous warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling she immediately tried to suppress. This became their new routine. Day bled into night, and the sprawling office became their shared, isolated world. They were two solitary figures against the glittering backdrop of the New York skyline, a silent, unwilling partnership forged in the crucible of corporate warfare. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the tense, awkward silence of a superior and his subordinate, but a more complex, charged quietude. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions, with the things they observed about each other when they thought the other wasn't looking. She noticed the way he would unconsciously rub the faint scar on his hand when he was deep in thought. He noticed the way she would bite her lower lip when she was concentrating, a small, unconscious gesture of vulnerability that seemed entirely out of place in his world. One night the exhaustion finally broke through his iron control. She saw him lean back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose, and for a fleeting moment, the ruthless billionaire disappeared, replaced by a man who looked profoundly tired and utterly alone. An impulse she couldn't explain or control moved her. She quietly stood, went to the small, private kitchenette adjoining his office, and prepared a simple cup of black tea, just the way she'd seen him order it once. She placed it on the edge of his desk without a word. It was a small, human gesture, a drop of warmth in the arctic expanse of his existence, and she immediately felt foolish, exposed for having made it. She expected him to ignore it, or worse, to question her motives with his typical cutting suspicion. He stared at the steaming mug for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached for it. As he took the cup, his fingers brushed against hers, a deliberate, lingering contact this time. The shock was even more potent than before, a low, humming current that traveled straight to her core. He did not pull away. His pale gray eyes lifted to meet hers, and the analytical coldness was gone, replaced by something raw and searching. It was a look that asked 1,000 questions she couldn't possibly answer. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted, hanging precariously in the balance. He was no longer just her boss. He was a man, and she was a woman, and the air between them crackled with the dangerous, unspoken acknowledgement of that simple, terrifying fact. He began to speak to her then, not just about the deal, but about the philosophy behind it. He spoke of weakness as a contagion, of trust as a fatal liability. "In this world, you are either the one who eats or the one who is eaten," he said, his voice low and intense, his gaze never leaving hers. "There is no in-between." He was showing her the dark, predatory machinery of his mind, testing her, daring her to be repulsed. But to her shame and confusion, she was not. She was captivated. She saw the world through his eyes, a brutal, unforgiving chessboard where every move was a matter of survival. She listened, not as his assistant, but as a confidant, drawn deeper into the chilling logic of a world she had always feared and despised. A war began to rage within her. A part of her, the part that loved poetry and believed in the inherent goodness of people, was horrified. This man represented everything she stood for against: greed, ruthlessness, a complete disregard for the human cost of his ambition. He was the architect of the very system that was crushing her family. Yet another, more primal part of her responded to him on a level she couldn't understand. She was drawn to his strength, to the unshakable certainty with which he moved through the world. He was a storm, and she, who had spent her entire life seeking shelter, found herself inexplicably wanting to stand in the heart of the tempest, just to feel its power. The desire was a poison, a sweet, deadly venom seeping into her veins. The Sterling takeover hit a critical obstacle. A key shareholder, a man with a personal vendetta against Julian, was threatening to block the deal. The pressure in the office became immense, a suffocating force. One evening, after a particularly brutal conference call, Julian's control finally snapped. With a low curse, he swept a stack of documents off his desk, sending a cascade of white paper fluttering to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. Ilara froze, her heart pounding. She had only ever seen him in perfect, icy command. This sudden, violent eruption of emotion was terrifying, but it was also undeniably human. It was the first crack she had seen in the fortress he had built around himself. Instead of shrinking away in fear, Ilara moved with a quiet, deliberate calm. She knelt and began to gather the scattered pages, her movements methodical and soothing. She didn't look at him or speak to him, simply restoring order to the chaos he had created. He stood over her, breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. He watched her, his anger slowly receding, replaced by a stunned, intense watchfulness. Her quiet strength, her refusal to be intimidated by his rage, seemed to disarm him completely. When she had collected the last page, she stood and placed the neat stack back on his desk. She looked at him then, her gaze steady and unafraid, and in her eyes he saw not fear or judgment, but a profound and unsettling empathy. "They always betray you in the end," he said, his voice rough, almost a whisper, "the ones you allow closest to you. They find your weakness and they use it to tear you down." He wasn't talking about the shareholder anymore. He was opening a door, just a crack, to the haunted, sealed-off rooms of his past. He was speaking of the wound that festered beneath the scar tissue of his success. He looked at Ilara as if she were the very embodiment of that weakness, a dangerous vulnerability that had somehow infiltrated his defenses. And in that moment she understood that his cruelty was not a source of strength but a shield, a desperate, lifelong defense against a pain so deep it had shaped his very soul. The next evening the tension between them had transformed into something thick and tangible, a physical presence in the room. He came to stand behind her as she was reviewing a contract on her screen, his body so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He leaned in to point to a specific clause, his arm brushing against her shoulder. The scent of him enveloped her, clean, masculine, intoxicating. Her breath caught in her throat, and every nerve in her body came alive, screamingly aware of his proximity. She could feel the soft fabric of his suit against her arm, hear the quiet sound of his breathing. The sterile office, the complex legal document, the billion-dollar deal, it all faded away, leaving only the overwhelming, undeniable reality of his body next to hers. Her own body was a traitor. A slow, deep heat bloomed in her stomach, spreading through her limbs, making her feel heavy and weak. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that she was sure he must be able to hear. This feeling, this raw, consuming physical awareness, was entirely new to her. It was the desire she had only ever read about in books, the great, terrifying force that poets wrote of. And it was being awakened not by a gentle, kind man who shared her ideals, but by a cold, ruthless predator who stood for everything she opposed. The discovery was horrifying. She was desiring the very thing she had always believed would destroy her, and she felt a terrifying, exhilarating lack of control over her own response. Julian must have sensed the shift in her, the tremor that ran through her body. He straightened abruptly, putting a stark foot of distance between them. A muscle flexed in his jaw, and he turned away from her, walking back to the cold sanctuary of his desk. He was fighting it too. She could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the way he clenched and unclenched his fists. He had built his life on the principle of absolute control, on the eradication of all emotional vulnerability. And she, with her quiet empathy, her guileless sincerity, and her infuriatingly innocent presence, was a threat to that control. She was a complication he had not anticipated, a variable that didn't fit into his cold equations, and the struggle against his own unwilling attraction was written all over him. The dilemma crystallized in Ilara's mind with a painful, terrifying clarity. Her life had always been a simple equation of duty versus self. She had always chosen duty. She thought of her sister, of the mountain of bills on her kitchen table, of her mother's worried voice on the phone. That was her reality, her responsibility. Then, she thought of the heat of Julian's body next to hers, the searching look in his pale eyes, the way her name had sounded on his lips just once, in a moment of unguarded intensity. This was a new, dangerous variable. Ceding to this desire felt like a betrayal of everything she was, a surrender of the last piece of herself she had managed to keep pure, but denying it felt like a betrayal of the woman she was just discovering she could be. The work was finally done. The summary was complete. A flawless, exhaustive document that had cost her nearly a week of her life. She placed it on his desk as the first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. He took it without looking at it, his attention fixed solely on her. The air was thick with exhaustion, and 1,000 things left unsaid. "You can go home, Miss Vance," he said, his voice formal again, the walls back up. She nodded, turning to leave, a hollow feeling of anticlimax echoing in her chest. But as her hand touched the cool metal of the doorknob, his voice stopped her, low and rough. "Ilera." She turned back slowly, her heart stopping in her chest. It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded both foreign and incredibly intimate, coming from his lips, a deliberate crossing of a line. He stood by the window, a dark silhouette against the rising sun, his face in shadow. He said nothing more, but he didn't have to. His eyes held hers across the vast expanse of the room, and in his gaze she saw the entire violent conflict raging within him. The cold, calculating strategist at war with the man who was drawn to her against his own will. She left his office with the sound of her own name echoing in her soul, knowing that the choice she had to make was no longer just about duty or desire. It was about him. She did not go home. The command to leave his office was an expulsion from one world, but it did not return her to the other. Instead, she stood in the empty, echoing lobby, the city lights a blur of cold fire through the glass. To return to her small apartment, to the ledger and the bills, felt like a retreat, a surrender to the very life she was beginning to question. The sound of her own name spoken by him had been a key turning a lock deep inside her. It had unlocked a terrifying resolve. She would not be dismissed. She would not be a cog in his machine that could simply be sent away when the work was done. In a move that defied every cautious, sensible instinct she had ever cultivated, she turned not toward the subway but toward the street, hailing a cab with a trembling hand and giving the driver an address she had only ever seen on corporate letterhead, his. The journey to his penthouse was a silent, vertical ascent into another reality. The taxi ride through the glittering canyons of Manhattan felt unreal, as if she were a ghost moving through a city that wasn't hers. The doorman in the impossibly opulent lobby regarded her simple coat with a flicker of disdain, but the name Thorne was a magic word that opened all doors. The private elevator was a silent mirrored cage, whisking her upward through the spine of the building. With each floor, the pressure in her ears grew, a physical manifestation of the social and emotional altitude she was breaching. She watched her own pale, determined face in the polished brass, a stranger about to commit the greatest act of transgression of her life, driven by a force she could no longer name or control. He opened the door himself, a shocking breach of his usual protocol. He was without his suit jacket, his white shirt open at the collar, revealing the strong column of his throat. He looked utterly unguarded, and for a moment, profoundly weary. Surprise, then a flash of raw anger tightened his features when he saw her. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. But she did not flinch. She looked past him into the cavernous space beyond. It was exactly as she'd imagined. A cold cathedral of glass and steel, filled with minimalist furniture and a silence that screamed of loneliness. The entire city was a glittering carpet laid at his feet, yet the space felt like the most desolate place on earth. She stepped past him, over the threshold, and into the heart of his fortress. Ilara turned to face him in the center of the vast room, the city lights forming a halo around her. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her voice was steady, imbued with a clarity that came from having nothing left to lose. "I came here to tell you something," she began, her gaze unwavering. "I am not afraid of you. I am not impressed by your power or your money. I have looked into your eyes for weeks, Mr. Thorne, and I have seen the wasteland you carry inside you." She took a breath, the words a final, irrevocable severance from her old self. "And for that, I don't feel admiration or fear. I feel a profound, aching pity for you." The word hung in the air between them, a blasphemy in his temple of power, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. His face contorted, a mask of fury struggling against a deeper, more profound shock. He took a step toward her, his hands clenched into fists, the predator re-emerging, but her quiet, empathetic gaze did not waver, and his anger crumbled, leaving something raw and broken in its place. "Pity?" he whispered, the word ragged, torn from him. And then, the dam broke. He began to speak, the words spilling out in a torrent of long-buried pain. He spoke of a father's betrayal, of a family fortune lost overnight, of a mother's slow, heartbreaking decline. He spoke of being a boy forced to watch the world tear apart everything he loved, vowing to become so powerful, so untouchable, that no one could ever hurt him again. He was confessing not to his assistant, but to the only person who had ever seen the ghost of that boy still haunting the man. The raw agony in his voice was an invisible current, pulling her closer. The vast, empty space between them suddenly felt suffocatingly small. When his confession finally tapered off into a ragged, shuddering silence, she did the one thing his world of transactions and betrayals could never have predicted. She reached out and laid her hand gently on his arm. The contact was electric, a spark of warmth against the rigid, corded muscle. He flinched as if burned, but did not pull away. He looked down at her small hand on his sleeve. Then slowly, hesitantly, his own hand came up to cover hers. His touch was not gentle. It was a desperate, grasping hold, the grip of a drowning man clinging to the first piece of solid ground he has felt in a lifetime. He looked at her then, his pale gray eyes stripped of all their icy defenses, revealing the vast, desolate ocean of his loneliness. He leaned in, and she met him halfway, rising on her toes. Their first kiss was not a tender exploration. It was a collision. It was desperate and raw, a frantic, searching expression of all the unspoken tension, all the shared isolation of those long nights in the office. It was a kiss that tasted of his pain and her compassion, of his long-starved hunger and her burgeoning, terrifying desire. It was the shattering of 1,000 rules, the obliteration of the line between boss and secretary, man and woman, predator and prey. In that moment, they were simply two broken souls clinging to each other in the dark, and it was the most honest thing either of them had ever known. Without a word, he took her hand and led her from the living room, through hallways that felt like empty museum corridors, and into his bedroom. The room was dominated by a single, massive bed and a wall of glass that looked out upon the endless, glittering expanse of the city. The world was at his feet, yet here, in the heart of his power, he seemed small and vulnerable. He stopped before the window, turning to face her, his expression a maelstrom of fear and need. This was the final threshold. She saw the question in his eyes, the silent, desperate plea for her to either save him or leave him to his solitude. And in that moment, Hilaire Vance made a choice that was entirely her own. Not for her sister, not for the debt, but for the broken man she saw before her, and for the woman he had awakened in her. She reached up and gently touched the scar on his hand, a silent acknowledgement of the wound he had finally shown her. That simple, accepting gesture was her answer. The act that followed was a continuation of that raw, desperate honesty. It was not the gentle, romantic union she had read about in her books. It was a fierce, profound, and almost painful intimacy. It was the surrender of her long-guarded innocence, not as a sacrifice, but as a gift, a final, defiant act of empathy. For him, it was a terrifying act of vulnerability, allowing someone into the fortress he had spent a lifetime building. It was a collision of his cynical experience and her guarded idealism, a desperate, shared attempt to feel something real in a world that had offered them both nothing but pain and obligation. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, the city lights painting shifting patterns across their bodies. The silence that fell was different from any they had shared before. It was not empty or tense, but heavy with the weight of what had just happened. His breathing was deep and even, his head resting near her shoulder, the first true peace she had ever seen on his face. She traced the line of his jaw with a trembling finger, a wave of impossible tenderness washing over her. The world outside, with its debts and its deals, had ceased to exist. In this single transgressive act, she had shattered the cage of her old life. She had surrendered her body, but in doing so, she had claimed a part of her soul she never knew she possessed, unaware that the dawn would bring with it a consequence more devastating than any she could have ever imagined. The dawn light that filtered into the penthouse was not the soft, promising glow of a new day, but a clinical, accusatory blade that sliced across the vast, empty bed. Ilara awoke to a profound and chilling silence, a stillness that was a stark contrast to the tumultuous emotional storm of the night before. The sheets beside her were cold, the indentation of his body already gone, as if he had been a phantom she had merely dreamt. She sat up, clutching the fine Egyptian cotton to her chest, a futile shield against the sudden, overwhelming exposure. The city, which had seemed a romantic, glittering witness just hours ago, was now a cold, indifferent observer. She was a trespasser in this sterile sanctuary of glass and steel, a ghost in the machine of his wealth, and the intimacy they had shared felt like a fever that had broken, leaving her weak and utterly alone in its wake. A frantic, desperate hope propelled her from the bed. Perhaps he was in another room, making coffee, or had simply stepped away for a moment. She moved through the cavernous apartment, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floors, her own name a silent, unanswered question on her lips. The space was pristine, devoid of any sign of the raw, messy humanity that had unfolded within its walls. There was no note, no trace of him, nothing but the crushing emptiness. It was only when she returned to the bedroom, her heart sinking with each step, that she saw it. Placed squarely on the polished wood of the nightstand, where a lover might have left a rose, was a check. It was a corporate check, drawn from a Thorn Capital account. The name printed in a severe, impersonal font. It was made out to her, Ilara Vance, for an amount that would not just cover Chloe's debts, but erase them from existence entirely. The sight of it was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The numbers, written in his sharp, decisive hand, seemed to mock her. Every tender touch, every whispered confession, every moment of raw, shared vulnerability from the night was instantly and brutally recontextualized. It was not a connection, it was a transaction. He had assessed her need, calculated her price, and paid it in full upon services rendered. The check was a receipt for her innocence, a final, damning piece of evidence in the case against her own foolish heart. The humiliation was a hot, searing wave that washed over her, so potent it made her physically sick. She had pitied him, had seen the broken boy inside the monster, and he had seen her as nothing more than the final, most valuable asset required to close the deal of his life, an acquisition to be logged and filed away. A desperate, primal need to escape seized her. She scrambled to gather her clothes, which lay discarded on a cold leather armchair, feeling like the remnants of a stranger's life. Her simple skirt and blouse, the armor of her former self, felt cheap and soiled in this cathedral of wealth. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons, her body shaking with a toxic cocktail of shame and a burgeoning, icy rage. She did not look at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows as she fled, unable to face the woman who had so willingly surrendered the last pure thing she owned. The silent, mirrored elevator that carried her down was a cage of judgment, its descent a brutal, symbolic fall from a grace she hadn't even known she possessed. She had walked into his world hoping to find a man, but she was leaving having been treated as nothing more than a commodity. Her own small apartment felt both like a sanctuary and a prison. The familiar scent of old books and lemon polish was a comfort, but the space itself seemed to shrink around her, suffocating her with the reality of the life she had tried, for one night, to escape. The check, which she had snatched from the nightstand in a daze, felt like a burning coal in her pocket. She laid it on her worn kitchen table, and it looked obscene against the scarred wood, a piece of an alien world that had come to contaminate her own. She thought of her sister, of her mother's worried face, and a fresh wave of guilt crashed over her. She had secured their future, but she had done it by betraying a fundamental part of herself. The silence in her apartment was no longer lonely. It was accusatory, filled with the ghosts of her own compromised ideals. The hours bled into a day, then another, each one marked by a surgical silence from him. There were no calls, no emails, not a single word to acknowledge what had passed between them. He had simply vanished, retreating back into his world of international flights and billion-dollar deals, leaving her to grapple with the wreckage. His silence was more cruel than any verbal dismissal could have been. It was an act of erasure, a deliberate negation of her existence, and the significance of their shared intimacy. He had taken what he wanted, her body, her empathy, the final leverage for his deal, and then had simply cut the connection, as cleanly and ruthlessly as he would sever a failing division of his company. She was a loose end, neatly tied up and disposed of, and the cold professional finality of it was the deepest wound of all. When she finally spoke to her mother, her voice was a hollow echo of its former self. She couldn't explain the source of the money, offering only a vague, unconvincing story about a significant bonus for her work on the sterling acquisition. The joy and relief in her mother's voice was a knife in her heart, each grateful word a fresh twist of the blade. She had saved her family, but in doing so, she had erected a new, invisible wall between them. The secret of that night, of the true cost of their salvation, isolated her completely. She was an island in her own family, celebrated as a savior while privately drowning in the shame of a sacrifice they could never understand. The financial burden was lifted, but it had been replaced by a moral weight that felt infinitely heavier, a debt to her own soul that she feared she could never repay. In the week that followed, Ilara moved through a fog of grief and disorientation. She formally resigned from Thorn Capital via a sterile email, receiving an equally impersonal acceptance from Human Resources. The severing of that tie was a small, hollow victory. The pain of his betrayal was a constant, physical ache in her chest, but beneath it, something else was beginning to stir. It was a slow, simmering anger, a resentment that was far more empowering than her shame. He had expected her to be a victim, a fragile thing to be used and discarded. He had underestimated her. The memory of their night, though tainted by its transactional end, still held a core of undeniable truth. She had seen him, the real him, and she had not broken. She had met his power with her empathy, his darkness with her light, and for a moment she had been his equal. One evening she stood before the small, cracked mirror in her hallway, the same mirror where she had once seen a tired, resigned girl. The reflection that looked back now was different. Her eyes were no longer soft and dreaming. They were shadowed, yes, but they held a new, hard-won clarity. The innocence was gone, burned away in the crucible of his penthouse, but in its place was a nascent strength she had never known she possessed. She had survived him. She had walked into the heart of the storm and had emerged, battered and bruised, but not destroyed. The experience had been a fire, and it had forged her into something new, something stronger. The timid girl who read poetry was still there, but she now shared a body with a woman who had faced a monster and had refused to be devoured. With a newfound, deliberate resolve, she took the check from the table. It was no longer a symbol of her shame, but a tool. It was her severance pay, the price he had paid not for her body, but for underestimating her soul. She would use it to heal her sister, to build a new life, to free herself not just from debt, but from the cage of her own fear. The act of walking into the bank and depositing the check was a final, declarative act of separation. It was not his money saving her, it was her choice, her sacrifice, her strength. She was closing the account on Julian Thorne, severing the connection on her own terms. He had intended to be the one to walk away, but she now realized that she was the one who was truly leaving him behind, alone in his cold, empty fortress. 6 months had passed, a season of quiet healing and deliberate reconstruction. Ilara now moved through a world that smelled not of industrial-grade cleaner and cold glass, but of aging paper and brewing tea. She had used a small portion of the money to purchase a struggling second-hand bookstore in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, a sanctuary of her own making. Here, surrounded by the silent, waiting stories of 1,000 other lives, she was slowly rediscovering the woman she had been before the debt, before him. The work was hard, the profit was modest, but the currency she dealt in now was joy, not survival. Each book she shelved, each customer she helped, was a small act of reclaiming her soul. The ghost of the 50th floor still lingered in the quiet moments, but its power to haunt her was fading with every sunrise she watched from her own window, a sunrise she now owned. This fragile peace was shattered one rainy Tuesday afternoon by the arrival of a courier. He carried a slim, elegant black box, its surface matte and severe, bearing no return address but marked with a single, embossed silver T that made her blood run cold. It was an artifact from another universe, an intrusion of his world of stark, minimalist power into her soft, cluttered haven of worn spines and faded ink. She accepted it with a hand that did not tremble, a small victory in itself, and placed it on the worn oak counter. For a long time she simply stared at it, this Trojan horse sent from a kingdom she had fled. A part of her wanted to throw it away, to refuse this final, silent communication. But a deeper, more honest part of her, the part that still ached with the memory of his confession, knew she had to open it. With a deep, steadying breath she lifted the lid. Nestled within a bed of black silk was not a piece of jewelry or a legal document, but something that made her heart stop. It was a book. A small, leather-bound first edition of a collection of poems by her favorite obscure poet, the very one she had quoted to herself in the darkest hours of the night. It was worn, its corners softened by time, its pages edged in faded gold. It was an object of profound, intimate knowledge. This was not a gift of wealth, but a gift of memory. It was his way of saying, without words, that he had seen her. Not the efficient assistant, not the desperate girl, but the dreamer who found solace in verses written a century ago. It was an acknowledgement of the soul she had thought he'd never even noticed, let alone remembered. Tucked inside the front cover was a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored stationery. His handwriting was just as she remembered from his annotations on legal briefs, sharp, decisive, and devoid of flourish. The note was brutally short, stripped of all pleasantries. "The check was an act of cowardice," it began. "It is the only language I was ever taught for things of immense value. I saw the goodness in you, Alara, and I was terrified, not of you, but of the certainty that a man like me would eventually destroy something so rare. I sent you away to protect you from myself." It was not an apology, not an excuse. It was a confession, a final, starkly honest addendum to the one he had made that night in his penthouse. A piece of the truth that reframed everything. The tears that finally fell were not the hot tears of shame she had shed in his empty bed, but a slow, quiet stream of pure, unadulterated release. The weight she had been carrying for 6 months, the belief that she had been nothing more than a transaction, crumbled and fell away. The memory of their night together shifted in the landscape of her mind. It was no longer a scar of humiliation, but a profound, bittersweet monument to a connection that was too raw, too real for the broken world he inhabited. He had not discarded her because she was worthless. He had pushed her away because, in his own damaged way, he had seen her as priceless. The pity she had once felt for him returned, no longer aching and sharp, but soft and expansive, an empathetic acceptance of a tragedy that belonged to them both. She stood at the window of her bookstore, the worn leather of the book cool and solid in her hands, and watched the afternoon rain wash the city clean. The future was no longer a path of obligation, but an open, unwritten page. The story of Alara and Julian was over, but her own story, the one she would write for herself, was just beginning. She was free, not because of his money, but because she had finally understood the truth. He had not been her destroyer. He had been the storm that had cleared the way for her to finally grow. If you believe their story found its own kind of peace and that a new chapter is waiting for her, please subscribe, like, and share. We invite you to comment with your thoughts on what her future holds.